The Cannabis Conversation. A European perspective on the emerging legal cannabis industry.
Welcome to the Cannabis Conversation with Andrew DeAngelo, where we explore the new legal cannabis industry by speaking to the professionals that are helping to shape it. On today's show, we have Andrew DeAngelo. Andrew is a longtime advocate and activist, and now a prominent cannabis industry consultant. He's also the brother of Steve, who's been a previous guest, so great to have another family member on. Andrew, welcome. How you doing?
Well, thank you for having me on the Cannabis Conversation. Nice to be with you all today.
No, real pleasure. Thank you. Where in the world are you?
I live in the Oakland Hills, Oakland, California, Bay Area.
Fantastic. So, perfect person to speak to about Californian cannabis industry, which will be our topic for today. We'll get into that in a minute, but we always like to start with a bit about you. So if you can tell us a bit about your background and how you got into cannabis, and that would be great.
Sure. Well, as you mentioned, Steve DeAngelo is my older brother. Steve's about 10 years older than me, and he started trading cannabis at a pretty young age when he was a teenager, and I was just getting out of diapers, basically, when he started his career. So I grew up with cannabis all around me. My brother did not try to hide his career from his little brother, and he was very honest about what he was doing, very proud of what he was doing, even in the 1970s. This was the 1970s when cannabis, the conversation of cannabis, let us say, was much different than it is today. So Steve, I was lucky. I had that guide, my older brother. Many of us that have experienced cannabis had some kind of guide, someone that shared it with us for the first time and hopefully taught us a few things about how to interact with the compound in a responsible, safe, and good way. But I was lucky. So I had that with Steve. And, you know, we had a difficult childhood. My brother died. My parents split up. My brother left home at a young age. The Vietnam War was happening. The politics of social change was gripping our country. And it had a big impact on my family. And my mom was part of the women's rights movement that was happening at that time. And my dad wasn't real happy with that. And so my parents split up and I had to grow up sort of in a broken household. And cannabis, that's traumatic. It's always traumatic when you grow up in a broken household. And so cannabis, when cannabis came into my life as a teenager, because of my older brother, saw me in a lot of physical and emotional pain as a teenager. And he handed me a joint one day in my mom's kitchen. And a little voice inside me said I should take that joint. And I did. And pretty much immediately, I started to experience the healing aspects of the plant. And I started to understand more about my childhood and what I needed to do to become an adult that was at peace with what happened to me as a kid. You know, my parents were not abusive or anything like that. We had a lot of love in our family, but the people were not real happy with each other. And there was a lot of conflict. And, you know, we're Italians on my father's side and Welsh on my mother's side. So we get very passionate in our discussions with each other. And so there was a lot of shouting when I was a kid. And so cannabis played a big part in allowing me to come to peace with all that. And I'm very proud to say that my parents, by the end of their lives, were both using cannabis medicinally, both CBD and THC and other cannabinoids. And we're all together in our cannabis business. We had a cannabis dispensary, medical, and now adult use dispensary called Harborside. And my parents helped finance that business and were a big part of it before they died. So we had a very long cannabis journey in our family because obviously my parents were not happy when we first started trading in cannabis. And there was quite a bit of conflict about that. But by the end, once we were able to legalize in California in 1996 for medical, we were able to get one of the first legal licenses to trade cannabis. And then my parents were like, okay, you've got a legal license now. okay, we're going to be okay with this and lean into it. So that was the journey of my path in cannabis and that of my family.
Yeah, thank you. That's such a candid description, and thank you for sharing that. I mean, one of the things that struck me is, and Steve talks about this a bit and sort of saying it's all kind of wellness, isn't it? So, but the way your story described it, I mean, most people's first interaction is what would be termed as recreational, but it sounds like you were kind of noticing the wellness and the medical properties of it helping you process things as well, which is quite nice to hear.
We didn't know that at the time. I didn't know to call it medical or wellness even. The word wellness just wasn't around in the 1980s. When I got turned on to cannabis, it was the 1980s. So we didn't have a name for it, but we knew it was healing. We knew it was healing. For us, it was about reducing stress and just chilling out and being relaxed and feeling positive. The 1980s was a very dark time if you were a progressive or a left-leaning person. It's kind of like being a progressive under Margaret Thatcher in England must have been frustrating. And because she was very good at what she did, and the conservatives dominated in our country for a long, long time, still a very conservative country, the United States. We're just now entering the progressive revolution, I hope. Or I don't know if revolution's the right word, but progressive change, our ideas and our social engineering is starting to happen globally now. So it was intuitive. For us, it was intuitive. We knew it was healing, but we were also getting stoned to have fun. I mean, let's not, be dishonest about that. It was all one thing for us. It was all one thing. We didn't know how to define what we were experiencing. The endocannabinoid system had not been discovered. THC had just been sort of discovered in Israel in the 60s, I think it was. So all of this was very new, the science, and it was not published, and it was not widely available, and it was suppressed. And so we had to dig pretty hard to learn how to name what we were feeling and what was happening to us. And of course, here in California, there's a terrible virus known as HIV/AIDS in the late 70s, 80s, and now, and in the late 80s. By the late 80s, people were dying by the thousands from HIV and AIDS. And a gentleman by the name of Dennis Perone in San Francisco, California, a gay man who lost his lover to AIDS. When his lover was dying, Dennis was a longtime cannabis dealer and trader and smoker and been working with the plant for a long time. And he saw that this plant he'd been working with for a long time was helping his lover who was dying of AIDS die in a more peaceful way, in a more compassionate way, a more less painful, less anxious way. You're dying. You're dying. It's a very hard thing. We're all dying right now, right? This virus has really taught us all. The coronavirus has really taught us all of that. So I think that, now we know how to name, we've learned so much about the healing properties of cannabis, and now we can name it wellness. We can name it medical cannabis. We have research. We have the Israelis have done a mountain of scientific research on this. This plant's been studied probably as much, if not more, than any plant on earth. And still, you hear the prohibitionists say, well, we just got to study it more. So now the world is, now we have a credible argument to make that this is a healing agent and plant at a global scale, because everybody has an endocannabinoid system. And we all, particularly in the modern world we live in, we need external cannabinoids to engage with that internal system, because the external stresses in our modern age are such that our endocannabinoid system just can't produce the cannabinoids fast enough to chill us out. So that's where the plant comes in, and that's why we evolved together, the plant and humanity. Yeah, it's amazing how when you study genes and stuff, plants and animals and humans, the genes are not too much different. So, and that interconnectivity, I think, is something I hope we're all starting to understand better as humanity, as a human race right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Very positive note there. Cool. Well, just before we start talking about California specifically, maybe you want to tell us a bit about what you're up to in terms of your consultancy, etc. If you're able to share a couple of the projects you're working on or anything like that.
Sure. Well, I've been a strategic advisor and consultant for the last year or two, so I'm just starting to learn about how to do that in a good way. I do that as an individual, so I help usually smaller and regional entrepreneurs get into the cannabis industry and build their businesses, whether it's cultivation or manufacturing or retailing or all three of those things sometimes. And then I'm part of some bigger firms like Global Go and Global Positioning Strategies, GPS, Bob Hoban's group. And then there's Regenibus, which is the one that's closest to my heart, because Regenibus is all about bringing environmental sustainability to the cannabis industry and social equity, social justice and social equity to the cannabis industry. So those firms I work with because they have things that I don't have, like a legal team and compliance people, and they know how to get licenses, which I don't really particularly want to fill out all the paperwork to apply for licenses. I help people build things and build their business and build their teams and get their products to market. So that's what I'm really good at, and that's what I understand very well, trading in this plant for as long as I have. And, I do a lot of pro bono work for smaller folks. The barriers to entry into the cannabis industry in the United States are very high, unfortunately. We'll talk about that in a second, but the legal frameworks here are not designed well. We've done a kind of a crappy job of designing the framework. So small business legacy people like me have been doing this a long time, simply don't have the resources to get a license and get into the legal business. And so we have this terrible problem in California where we have two markets. One, I guess people call illicit or underground market. I call it the legacy market. And then we have this legal licensed market. And the legal licensed market is only capturing about 20 or 25% of all the cannabis transactions in the state of California right now. And the legacy or underground market is capturing about 75% of those transactions. And we've been in this framework we're going on our fourth year now. We have one party Democratic rule in California, and we still have not been able to enact the reforms we need to enact to get small legacy and particularly people of color into the industry. So I help those folks pro bono to get in, and I'm hoping that we can build investment funds and vertically integrated businesses and supply chains in various states and even countries that allow these small legacy and people of color and folks that have been working with the plant for a long time, and sustaining themselves and sustaining their families for a long time, don't have to stop doing it or don't have to keep doing it in an underground setting and can come out of the shadows and into the light. So that's sort of where I'm very passionate about my work as a consultant. I do have to pay my mortgage and I do have to keep the lights on here. So I have to have a robust client base that is able to pay me. But what's fun about being a consultant and not running one company is I get to build the whole industry, not just, most of my clients are not in California. They're in other states, they're in other countries sometimes. And it's a lot of fun to be able to take what we started in California and sort of export it to the rest of the country and the world. And so I'm having a lot of fun doing that.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I mean, that mirrors my experience of consultancy too. I'm basically interested in so many areas of the plant that I kind of don't want to focus on one small bit. And there's so many different things that are going on. There's so much amazing research and new products and new ideas that I think being a consultant is a great way to sort of spread your interests. So I totally understand where you're coming from. But yeah, let's move on to the main topic of the show, California. I mean, wow, there's so much we're probably not going to do it justice. So maybe, we'll focus on an overview, and perhaps you can maybe start with the history of kind of legal cannabis, and then prior to that, and the medical program, etc.
Sure. Well, for those of you that are in England, California is probably a story of legalization that excites you and that makes you feel like it's very successful, because we actually have a supply chain. We actually have dispensaries. You can actually go to them if you're over 21, and you can purchase all kinds of wonderful cannabis products. But I'm here to tell you that California has legalized, is the poster child for how not to legalize cannabis. And so I hope that countries like England, Mexico, which is in the process of legalizing right now as we speak, will do a better job and learn from some of the mistakes we've made in California. But the history actually goes back a long time. So cannabis was made federally legal in 1937. And pretty much the day after that happened, there were cannabis traders and activists trying to change that law. And it took a very long time, because the people in power that passed that law and the federal agency in charge of enforcing that law was very powerful. And we could not change that law for a long time. The first in California in the 60s, the people of California decided that they wanted to have a mechanism that they could pass laws themselves. So they created a process by which citizens can collect signatures and place an issue on the ballot for everybody to vote on the next election. It requires a lot of signatures, and it's very hard to overcome the barrier of entry needed to get something on the ballot in California. It literally requires millions of people to sign a petition, and all those signatures are checked and to make sure they're valid. And so the first effort to legalize weed in California was, I think it was 1972 or 1974. There was a successful effort, and it was on the ballot, and it lost. It lost terribly. I mean, I think it was, 70 to 30% or, something like that. Terrible. We just got crushed. And then it took a long time. Because the war on drugs happened, Ronald Reagan happened, all of a sudden cannabis was like this, worse than heroin. And that was the story that was being told. And people bought it, hook, line, and sinker. And so we had a drug war that was launched mainly against people of color, but also legacy people like me. Both my brother and I have been locked up and had our lives destroyed by law enforcement in that war, which is ongoing, by the way. As you know, in England, I'm sure your prisons are full of cannabis prisoners, just like ours are. Probably people of color there too, mostly. But then the AIDS crisis hit, as I mentioned a moment ago. And then thank God for the LGBTQ community, because they were so pissed off about the way they were being treated during their virus and crisis that they organized. And they had a radical wing. They had more mainstream wings. They had, the radical wing was a group called ACT UP. You may remember them with the pink triangle. And then there was more mainstream lawyers like yourself that were trying to get things on the ballot. So the first, in San Francisco, there's also a mechanism to get something on the ballot if you want. And in 1992, Dennis Perrone and Brownie Mary and his whole crew, John Entwistle, a whole bunch of people, brilliant people, brave, brilliant pioneers, got medical cannabis legal on the ballot in San Francisco, and the people passed it by 70% for this time, not 70%.
Yeah.
And it was great activism by that group of people, because for the first time, Dennis discovered that the way we change people's perception of cannabis is not by having him, the activist, be on camera making a inspirational speech. We did that for decades and it didn't work. All the rational arguments and inspirational speeches we made about personal freedom and so forth didn't work. But as soon as he put somebody that was dying of AIDS in a wheelchair in front of that camera and started talking about cannabis as a medical agent and a wellness property, then we started to change the perception in people's hearts. And that was the key. So that law at the city level inspired Dennis to collect the signatures to pass it at the state level. So in 1996, 4 years later, we were able to, and I was a young lad at this time. I was a student in San Francisco, but I helped collect the signatures. And Dennis already had a medical cannabis club in his house, basically, and I was trading a little bit of cannabis there too. And I was in the scene, but I was also a student, so I was not in the scene with both feet, just kind of 1 foot in the scene, 1 foot in school. But the ballot measure passed, and it passed with 69% of the vote in 1996, and we legalized medical cannabis. Well, then we had this problem where nobody at the local level wanted to license or legalize the supply chain. Everyone was afraid to have a cannabis shop in their neighborhood. Nobody wanted to have dispensaries, and the elected officials didn't know, okay, we've got this law. It says that if you have a medical recommendation, you can buy weed legally, but they had absolutely no clue to implement it. So they didn't implement it. And what happened was all these dispensaries started opening up, and it got out of control. And there wasn't any regulation. There wasn't any rules. There weren't any licenses. And the dispensaries, those early dispensaries, a lot of them were run by criminal organizations that were moving weed out the back door and by the ton or by the pound, and or they were activist-driven dispensaries by people like me, or more activist people that didn't really know how to run or operate a retail shop or have any sophistication with creating the experience for folks and making things so that all walks of life, not just, a stoner like me, would feel comfortable in. So those early dispensaries sort of got out of control, and the communities were like, well, we got to do something about this. And that's when Oakland issued their first licensing. This didn't happen until 03, 04, 05. So we had almost 10 years of, the wild, wild west out here. And then Oakland pioneered licensing cannabis, and we got one of the first licenses to open Harborside. And we wanted to open a retail shop that was different. We didn't want to do an activist shop, but we wanted our organization to be activist in some of the things that we do. But we didn't want to be only that. And we wanted our moms and grandmothers to feel comfortable coming into our shop. And we wanted conservative people who were sick, who had cancer or Alzheimer's or epilepsy or whatever it is, MS. And they'd come in and they would be terrified because they've been told their whole lives that this thing is bad, and they're sick. They're very sick. In some cases, they're dying, and they're confused. So we had to educate people. We had to be a school almost in those early days of cannabis. And we had to train our staff to be doctors almost, because the doctors didn't have the knowledge. They couldn't even talk about it. The Hippocratic Oath would not allow them to even talk about cannabis. Lawyers had that problem too. You have an oath that says you can't break the law. You can't knowingly break the law. But how do you serve cannabis clients when it's federally illegal without breaking law? So you have this ethical dilemma, okay, that is kind of a lie with respect to cannabis. But it is, so all these issues you have to sort through. And you're going to have to sort through them in England when you legalize weed there and you create frameworks there. And please don't make the same mistakes we did. So the medical framework actually in California, remember, the story's not finished. So we had a medical framework first. As I mentioned, no one regulated it. Then the city of Oakland regulated it. Then some other municipalities started to regulate it. The financial crisis hit. And then everyone's like, oh my God, we need tax money. So we started to get more licensing in more jurisdictions for the medical program during the financial crisis in 2008. And then Colorado, and then we tried to legalize for adult use in 2010 in California. So we put Prop 19, it was called, on the ballot in 2010. And unfortunately, it was a big strategic error for us to put legalizing weed on the ballot in a non-presidential election year. Because in the United States, when the presidential election years happen every 4 years, the turnout in our elections is 2 or 3 times as much as it is when the president is not running for re-election or election in the off years. We call those off-year elections. And those are like what's going to happen in 2022 is an off-year election. Well, 2010, when we put Prop 19 on the ballot, that was an off-year election, and we lost. We lost that vote by 3 or 4 percentage points. We came close, but we had a casino and alcohol trader named Sheldon Adelson from Nevada come in and fund opposition to that in 2010, and they beat us. Then, thankfully, Colorado and Washington, the activists there were a little bit smarter than we were in California, and they put adult use on their ballots in the presidential election year, and Obama was on the ballot that year in 2012, and a whole bunch of people came out to vote for Obama here in California, in Colorado and Washington, and they also voted to legalize weed in that same election. And then those 2 states, unfortunately, pioneered adult use legalization, not California. We weren't able to get adult use legalization done until 2018, some 8 years. 2016, during Trump's election, which was really bizarre to be celebrating the fact that we had legalized the weed in 2016, but also elected Trump. So then we realized very quickly that the framework that was designed for adult use legalization in California was no good. And the taxes were too high, which empowered the illicit or underground market. A lot of the local municipalities in California, they had the power under the framework to ban. So they banned. 60% of California still banned. Don't do that in England. Do not let the local people ban, or you will not have legal weed in England, because everybody will ban. Do not let them do that. It will be very hard because the local people will throw a fit. If you take their power away from them, they will, but you cannot give them that power, or you will have another 10 or 20 years where you're going to have to fight with the local people to get access to this plant, cheap, affordable, wide access to this plant. So that was a big mistake we made. And then there's all these barriers to entries to get a license in California. First you have to get a license from the state, then you have to get a license from the local people. Oftentimes you have to have all kinds of very expensive things to get your license, like a building, like a location, like extraction equipment, like lawyers, like compliance people. And all of a sudden you're looking at hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pounds to open a business that really shouldn't require all that at all. And in fact, the plant's been traded without all of that for a long time. The only thing that I think we did right was lab testing. I think lab testing is important for cannabis, not so much just to keep everybody honest, and make sure people aren't dumping chemicals in the weed to make it grow bigger. We have to, that I think is important. But of course, do we have to lab test weed more stringently than we do air, water, or food? No. Do we? Yes. So it's very hard to get through the lab test because heavy metals and all these things that apples and oranges and water and air don't have to pass, we have to pass. So, and it makes it very hard. So legalization is good in the sense that we got it done. It was very hard to get it done. We had to make a lot of compromises, hence the local control, hence the high taxes, hence. And if you compromise too much, you sell your own community down the river. And unfortunately, I'm not proud to say, I'm sad to say, that's what's happened here in California.
Wow, thank you. That's such a good overview of the sort of timeline up to today. And Yeah, it's a really kind of live topic because I think that, a lot of countries are probably looking to, well, I mean, California's like the fifth or sixth biggest economy in the world, isn't it? Just on its own. So we're looking to big jurisdictions like California and Canada and then Mexico when that comes online to see how they regulate and sort of figure out where you guys went wrong and what we can do, how we can kind of avoid those mistakes. But it's such a difficult line to tread, I think, that I don't think anyone's going to be free from mistakes, even if they learn from you guys as well. I think it'll be, individual to each jurisdiction, won't it?
Yeah, I think we have to choose what kind of mistakes we want to make with the frameworks. Yeah. So do we want to make mistakes that empower corporate cannabis? Or do we want to make mistakes that empower small entrepreneurs? And so the kinds of mistakes we choose to make have intention behind them. So we and so that's what we got wrong here. We really, really got wrong here. Again, 75% of all the cannabis transactions are still in the underground market. That was not what we promised the voters. That's not what even the elected officials who supported legalization promised. They promised that there would be wide, safe, and cheap, affordable access to cannabis in California, and that is just not true. There is not.
And so actually that's an interesting point and leads on to my next question. Is that a function at all of the fact that the illicit market in California is fairly sophisticated and, everyone's heard of the Emerald Triangle. So maybe my next question was to talk a bit about the cultivation in California and how it's sort of world famous in terms of, different cultivars. But has that got anything to do with why the illicit market has remained so strong in California?
Well, look, we cannabis people are very innovative folks. It's really hard to put us down. And we're just going to keep doing this until you put us in a cage or kill us. One of those two things has to happen. So that's a very hard adversary to defeat. And so the smarter thing is to bring that energy into the legal market and allow it to have its spot. That means big corporations are going to have to compete with us. They're going to lose sometimes because we know the community and the plant better than they do. And they're hiring a bunch of people from Walmart to run their shit. So, excuse my language. That is out. They're hiring people from Walmart to run their companies. So, we want our spot. And legacy people and people of color and people have been working with this plant for a long time. We don't need global domination. Don't even want it. Most of us don't. Some of us might. I don't. It's too stressful. Who wants to run Amazon? Are you kidding me? Too stressful. Too much. I'd like to sleep at night. I already have a hard time sleeping at night. So, that's not what our community's about. Investors and Fortune 500 entrepreneurs, they like global domination. I mean, it turns them on. It gives them a thrill and it motivates them. And they dedicate their whole lives to it, man. Their entire life is dedicated to that. And we have to harness that energy too. So I'm working with a concept right now called the Stoners and the Suits, building a bridge between activism and capitalism. That's the name of my piece. I hope to have it published. Forbes is talking about publishing it. We'll see. But I wanted to present that at South by Southwest. They turned me down this year. We'll see. Maybe we'll get in there next year. But we have to bring these two communities together, or there's going to be a war between the two, and it will be mutually assured destruction. There will not be a winner. The suits and the corporate guys think they can win that war. We'll just get law enforcement, we'll pass laws, and we'll go get these hippies and throw them in jail if they sell weed without a license. No, you won't. Go ahead and spend hundreds of millions of dollars on that and fill the prisons again. Go ahead, see what happens to you. It won't work out well for you at all.
And it hasn't worked out, has it? So
no.
Yeah.
And conversely, it's not gonna. The legacy people and the hippies in the hills of Humboldt cannot get this plant into every medicine cabinet on earth. We simply cannot. There's not enough of us. And we don't know how to do that. Now, one could say that the underground market's done a very good job creating safe, cheap, affordable access to cannabis in the world, and we have. That's why this is so critical, because we already have. We've already done it. I mean, to get a good bag of weed when I was 18 years old cost about $50. To get a good bag of weed right now costs about $50. So the underground market's done an excellent job with increasing the quality of weed while not increasing the price. If the legal market can't do that, boom, shoot yourself in the head, you're dead. So, and the legal market has not been able to do that, have not been able to do that. So, and people are tired of smoking mediocre weed that's grown in, greenhouses that are millions of square feet. And, so I want to see craft cannabis in there too. And I think we have a chance to build our spot and create a connection with consumers. I think people want to support companies like that. I think people want to buy weed from people who know and love the plant. And I think we just have to tell that story and get ourselves out there. And we're going to have to build some strategic alliances with each other and sort of get over ourselves and do that. And so my message to the stoners is also pretty intense, and just like my message to the suits is pretty intense. You have to stop the global domination. Hippies, yeah, we have to share. And we all have to share together. And it really is not that hard to do. And it actually is just as much fun as global domination, if not more, because the parties are better.
Yeah. I like that. It's a great message. I'm conscious of time, but there's lots we could talk about, but I wouldn't just mind actually if you could talk a bit about Humboldt and the Emerald Triangle, and just so why it's such an important place for cannabis and why it's sort of really leading the world in terms of the types of cannabis that's grown there.
Well, the Emerald Triangle is are 3 counties in California in a very remote northern part of the state. And back in the 60s and 70s, hippies basically and beatniks went up to that land to start communes and to get away from the dominant culture and the dominant society at that time, the Vietnam War and the draft and all that was happening. So a lot of young people went up into those hills and started communes, and they started growing weed and trying to find a new way to live. And that was the genesis of how those 3 counties, the Emerald Triangle, became so famous. The microclimate happens to be perfect for growing cannabis. And so the combination of a great microclimate and some very dedicated cannabis folks. And one of the early pioneers is actually Mountain Girl, Jerry Garcia's wife, who's still alive, by the way. And her daughter, Trixie Garcia, have a little cannabis brand going. So she was one of the early pioneers. She wrote one of the first books about growing weed and how to grow good weed up there. And this was before any of this was happening. This was the 60s and 60s. This was the 60s. So those early pioneers went to India and they traveled all over the world on the hippie trail, and they got cannabis seeds and they brought them back and they grew them and they bred them and they got obsessed with breeding and growing great weed. And year after year, season after season of doing that work, the weed became legendary. And first, it became legendary in the underground scene, and publications like High Times would celebrate it. Then there was a famous, and there still is a famous cannabis cup called the Emerald Cup, which is a celebration of all those growers in the Emerald Triangle. You have to grow outdoors or in greenhouse. You can't grow indoors in that cannabis cup. So they also pioneered outdoor and greenhouse growing because, unfortunately, they were forced indoors during the Reagan drug war, and that's how indoor cultivation came to be. Basically, that's still with us today. Unfortunately, indoor cannabis cultivation is an ecological disaster. And just the CO2 that you pump into the grow rooms that the plants need, well, it goes up into the sky and cooks the earth. So not good. So we need to get all of that outdoors and in greenhouse. production, and so those folks pioneered that as well. And now that community is in crisis. I mean, talk about barriers to entry. That community has probably been harmed the most by a bad legalization framework known as Prop 64 for adult use. And that community, how is that community going to survive now with legalization? Well, the way we're trying to make it survive is twofold. One, we passed a law in California somehow, despite how hard it is to get reform done in California, we did pass a law last year that creates appellations. So cannabis appellations, similar to wine appellations. So you can't call Bordeaux unless it's grown and made in Bordeaux. And you can't call something Humboldt if it's not grown and in Humboldt. And the state of California will enforce that law. So if you're in Massachusetts and you have a brand called Humboldt, and the state of California will sue you and they'll win. So that's one way we're trying to protect that community. The other way I think that community protects itself is it becomes a destination for tourism and for people all over the world. Some of your listeners right there in England would probably love to go to Humboldt and stay at a grow wellness retreat where you get to stay in a cool little cabin with a hot tub and solar panels on top, and you get massages all day long, and you walk around the weed field and you trim a little weed maybe and cure a little weed and smoke a little weed. And, you get to be in that culture, and you get to be a hippie for a week or two in your life. And you get to sort of, we pioneered a lot of things like sweat lodges. I mean, not the sweat lodge was obviously a native First Nations thing, but we adopted a lot of those things in California. When we adopted yoga blew up because California basically made it blow up in the United States. So we kind of pioneer things out here in California, despite we're a little bit eccentric and innovative and I don't know, some people might say a little crazy, but we've been able to, do this. And so that's the future of Humboldt. It's going to be appellations, good weed that someday you're going to be able to buy it in England. You're going to be able to buy Humboldt weed in England. It's going to come in this cool little package. You're going to open it up and the smell is going to hit you in the nose right away. And you're just going to be so excited. And that will happen. That's going to happen someday. So that community's in a lot of stress right now. And a lot of smart people, me included, are trying to figure out ways to reduce that crisis they're in right now and solve the problem. So that's the two ways I see the Emerald Triangle thriving, is the appellation designation and then also global tourism. Because the problem with the Emerald Triangle is they don't have a lot of infrastructure. They don't have a bunch of highways or roads. You can't bring a whole bunch of trucks in and out of there. And, you need that when you're growing a lot of weed. You need to be able to drive trucks around. You need to be able to access water tables. You need to be able to, have agricultural infrastructure that they simply don't have there, So that community is in a where they're innovating right now and trying to figure out how to survive and thrive.
Yeah, I was lucky enough to hang out with the Emerald Cup guys a couple of years ago. Actually, they came to the UK, and Frenchie Cannoli gave a great talk on appellations. So yeah, they're a great gang, actually.
Yeah, Frenchie's a legendary hash maker. So
absolutely,
he's all about super high quality water hash and other hashes he makes. He's a legend.
So passionate. I think it's the French accent as well, just sort of makes I love it. It's great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a really great discussion, and we'd love to have you back on at some point to sort of get an update on how things are going in California.
Anytime. I've really enjoyed our conversation today. Thank you.
No, appreciate it. Thanks, Andrew. Take care.